Grave robbing for radiation studies, volunteers in a lab suddenly fighting for their lives when their immune systems turned on them, and secret germ warfare units infecting people with plague and typhus. These are disturbing experiments that went horribly wrong. Alright, let's start with one of the most horrifying. Units 1644 and 8604. This was confirmed not too long ago by Japan's National Archives. These were secret units dedicated to biological warfare during the Second Sino-Japanese War, fought between China and Japan between 1937 and 1945. These secret units conducted experiments on human prisoners. Units 1644 and 8604 were both part of the Imperial Japanese Army's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. They infected prisoners with plague, cholera, typhus, and probably other stuff, so that scientists could study how the diseases developed, how contagious they were, and how fatal. The people they experimented on weren't treated like people at all. Researchers literally called them wooden logs. We've all heard of Unit 731, which did disturbing stuff like this, but it turns out these other units were involved too, all working together on different parts of the same biological testing program. And when Japan lost the war, a lot of the prisoners were either killed or burned so that there'd be no evidence left behind. Next up is TGN 1412, a trial disaster. At London's Northwick Park Hospital on March 13, 2006, 8 guys volunteered for what was supposed to be a simple medical trial. The trial was being run by a German biotechnology firm called Genero. 6 guys got the real injection, 2 got a placebo, and thank God for them. Everyone expected maybe it would be a light fever, possibly some tiredness at worst, but instead, within about an hour, the 6 men who got the real dose, they started experiencing pretty scary symptoms. Their heads swelled up, their temperatures shot up, and some of them started to shake uncontrollably. Nurses had to call emergency teams because the men were suddenly struggling to breathe, and their blood pressure was crashing. They were rushed into intensive care where doctors realized their immune systems had basically gone into overdrive and started damaging their own organs. One of the volunteers, a guy named Ryan Wilson, had the worst of it. His swelling was so extreme that newspapers later compared his appearance to the Elephant Man. He spent weeks in the hospital and ended up losing parts of several fingers and toes. The compound they were testing had looked completely harmless in every lab study and animal test before this. There were no signs something like this was going to happen. It's still one of the most infamous medical trial failures in modern history. In the 60s and 70s, University of California, San Francisco dermatologists conducted medical experiments on incarcerated men, at least 2,600 of them, and they weren't doing benign skin studies. The prisoners were exposed to pesticides and herbicides, both on their skin and via injection, so researchers could see what would happen. That's not all. In some experiments, mosquito cages were placed either next to or directly on the men's skin. But why? They were studying how attractive different humans are to mosquitoes, basically turning people into human bait. A report released in 2022 by UCSF's Program for Historical Reconciliation found, quote, questionable informed consent practices. So some of these prisoners may not have really known what they were signing up for. Anyone surprised by that though, really? I mean, who the hell would sign up for something like this unless you were getting paid a hefty sum of money? Also, many of the men didn't even have the medical conditions the researchers were supposedly treating. This one's probably the most infamous example of prisoners being exploited for scientific research. From 1951 to 1974, at Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, dermatologist Albert Kligman tested all kinds of stuff on inmates, including dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals in the world. Calling this guy a dermatologist, though, is a stretch. He's more of a mad scientist. Kligman exposed their skin and sometimes injected them with dangerous substances to study how they reacted. The conditions deeply shady. These prisoners often signed up for these experiments because they were paid or promised favors. But of course, the line between voluntary and coerced here is very blurry. Many of the inmates weren't there because of skin disease, so their involvement in the experiments made no medical sense either. Kligman also did radioactive testing on people. He infected them with viruses like herpes. He tested LSD on the men. It was completely unethical and out of hand, but back then there was just so little oversight for stuff like this, especially in prisons. So Kligman could just treat his test subjects like lab rats with little to no repercussions. Next is a psychological experiment from 1939 called the Monster Study. A group of researcher psychologists took 22 2 orphan children in Iowa and divided them into 2 groups. One group received positive reinforcement for how they talked. The other was unfairly criticized, constantly being corrected and told they stuttered even when they didn't. The psychologist peppered them with insults and made them feel ashamed of speaking. Well, unsurprisingly, many kids in that group went on to experience anxiety, low self-esteem, and ended up developing actual speech problems. Some of them genuinely believed they had a stutter long after the experiment ended. I mean, this is comic book levels of evil, right? The whole experiment is you just bully a bunch of orphans for years until they can't talk properly. Unsurprisingly, the study was kept secret for decades. Project Sunshine sounds like it should be about solar energy or something positive like that, but it's on this list, so it was anything but. Back in 1953, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission started secretly studying the effects of radioactive fallout on the human body. So to do that, they needed human bodies. Not live ones, thankfully, but they ended up using bodies of people who had died, often without their family's permission. In 1955, Dr. Willard Libby, the commissioner, openly talked about needing these remains for research. He said something along the lines of, "I don't know how to get them, but it is of prime importance to get them, especially from young people. If anyone knows how to do body snatching well, they'll be serving their country." Where's Ed Gein when you need him? It sounds like a dark joke. This was basically the government admitting they were going to dig up human remains without consent, and that's what they did. Scientists were snatching up bodies from graves to see how radiation would affect their organs and bones. Families had no idea, because, if they did, they obviously wouldn't have signed off on it. What's the point in burying someone if you're just going to let them get dug up later and blasted with radioactive fallout? Also in the 50s, psychologist Harry Harlow wanted to study depression and social behavior, so he took a bunch of baby rhesus monkeys and separated them from their mothers, then put them in isolation cages he called the Pit of Despair. As you can probably imagine, the effects were not pleasant. The monkeys were completely traumatized. Some refused to interact with other monkeys when they were reintroduced, couldn't form social bonds, and later failed as parents. These were creatures who'd never experienced normal social life. It destroyed them completely. Harlow claimed the research proved how important attachment is, and technically he was right, but did we really need to do an experiment like this to find that out? Wasn't that pretty obvious? In the 60s, psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to see how far people would go when told to obey authority. To test it, he brought volunteers into a lab and told them they'd be helping with a learning study. The volunteers were told that whenever the person in the next room got a question wrong, they were supposed to press a switch that delivered an electric shock. What they didn't know was that the person in the other room wasn't being shocked at all. He was just an actor, and the reactions were pre-recorded, but the volunteers thought it was all real. They heard shouts of pain as the actor in the next room would beg them to stop, but most people kept going because the guy in a lab coat was telling them that it was important to continue the test. And they went as far as to deliver what they believed were dangerous voltage levels. Now, this was obviously more ethical than the other experiments we've talked about so far. At least nobody was physically harmed, but the psychological effect this had on the volunteers was huge. A lot of them left the lab feeling sick about what they'd just done, thinking they might have actually nearly killed someone. But the study showed something deeply disturbing. You don't necessarily need to be a cruel person to do cruel things. Sometimes all it takes is someone in a position of authority telling you to. In September 1950, people in San Francisco woke up like it was any other day, completely unaware that a Navy ship sitting just offshore was spraying a cloud of bacteria into the air. This was part of a secret Cold War test. Nobody living there was told. The Navy just did it. They used 2 types of bacteria that they thought were relatively harmless. So harmless, supposedly, that they felt completely comfortable pumping them into a city of roughly 800,000 people. Well, over the next few days, doctors at Stanford Hospital noticed a cluster of rare infections called Serratia. 11 people got sick. One of them, a man named Edward Nevin, ended up with a bacteria in his heart valve and died. At the time, nobody had any idea this was connected to a military test. The truth didn't come out until the 70s, when Senate investigations started digging into secret Cold War experiments. Now let's head to Sweden, to the Vipeholm Hospital in Lund, where between 1947 and 1949, researchers were studying how sugar affects teeth. Instead of testing on volunteers who fully understood the risks, though, they used mentally disabled patients, people who couldn't give proper consent. The researchers loaded them up with sugary foods, candy, chocolate, those super sticky toffees you gotta take like an electric sander to your teeth to get rid of. Basically, they used anything that would rot their teeth as fast as possible. Unsurprisingly, their participants ended up with cavities all over their teeth, and the results weren't shared publicly for decades. The confectionery industry had helped fund the research, thinking there'd be no correlation between tooth decay and sugar, so they were not too thrilled about the results, and they paid to have the study kind of kept under wraps afterward. With all that said, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.